very much. I hope we all don't melt. So there'll be a lot of fire in the room, but we'll be okay. So what I'm going to do tonight is explore some of the historical and ethical challenges facing Israel-Palestine and reflect not only on my experiences in Israel-Palestine, but also the realities of growing up in America, in the American Jewish community. And then as an adult, learning about the lives of Palestinians and really becoming aware of the parallel narratives of the two peoples. I'm also going to explore some of the consequences of the Israeli occupation on the West Bank and Gaza, the Caesar Gaza and East Jerusalem, and ultimately the impact of the State of Israel for Jews and non-Jews in Israel-Palestine and the diaspora. To begin with, I want to give you a little more background on me. You got the sort of big name data points, but I did grow up in Sharon, Massachusetts, from a very nice Jewish girl kind of place. Hebrew school 3 days a week, bat mitzvah, Orthodox grandparents in Brooklyn, the pilgrimage to Israel with my family when I was 14. My mother was a Jewish writer, wrote a lot about the Holocaust. I was obsessed with the Holocaust early in my adolescence. So I started in a very traditional place. But I'm also a child of the 60s, so in college I was fighting the Vietnam War, and in medical school, healthcare reform became very important to me, and as an obstetrician, women's reproductive freedom. So I really became a much more political person. But this led to a very uncomfortable disconnect between my childhood love of Israel and the adult political person I had become. And over the years, I became increasingly aware of the occupation. I began to understand issues like colonialism and racism and issues around immigration and Islamophobia. And I became increasingly disenchanted with the version of history that I learned in Hebrew school. And that began my active search for all the voices that I had missed. So as was mentioned, I got involved with the Jewish-Palestinian Dialogue Group. This led to organizing health and human rights delegations, which really provided me with a primary education on the realities on the ground. I was also fortunate in 2012 to be a member of an interfaith peace builders delegation with the Dorothy Cotton Institute. She's a major civil rights leader who worked with Martin Luther King. And this was a group of African-American civil rights leaders and some lefty Jews who went to Israel and Palestine to study nonviolent resistance movements. So it was another incredible trip. And then last March, I was actually able to get into Gaza for the second time, but for 10 days with Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility. So these trips have been really the source of my information. Now, what I want to do is start by asking, what is the dominant paradigm when we look at this area of the world? And I think it's a familiar one. Jews have been victimized for centuries by anti-Semitism. This culminated in the Holocaust. Israel was created as a refuge. Some people believe Israel was given to the Jews by God. So it's a thriving democracy. It's a haven for the oppressed. It's a center of amazing culture, arts, science, universities, gorgeous beaches. This is what you hear. And it's basically a remarkable success story in a very dangerous neighborhood. Some of that is true, but this is the narrative of the victor. And what I would like to say is it's critical to research the narratives of the people who are usually not heard. And in this setting, that is the Palestinians. And when I do that, I find painful contradictions crying out for examination. And I see an increasingly belligerent occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, multiple hard-to-defend wars, and then a growing awareness of what we call cross-sectional issues around racism, police brutality, militarism, and then the impact of US foreign policy. And all of this has really forced me to examine much of what my family held dear. And as an increasingly secular person, I also began to scrutinize the meaning of my Jewishness and the consequences of Zionism. And I am part of a growing movement of Jews in the United States examining these hard things, from Americans for Peace Now, J Street, Jewish Voice for Peace, campus groups, there are a whole variety of range of political spectrums. But we're all concerned with the ongoing conflict, with our responsibilities as Jews and as US citizens, both to the State of Israel and to Palestinians. I would also argue that the self-definition of Jews as the perpetual victims, as well as the chosen people, has become an intensely toxic combination. And I think this is often exemplified by me, for me when I look at Elie Wiesel, who recently died at the age of 87, and he has an incredible reputation. He established the Holocaust as a central catastrophe of the 20th century. He's able to apply his knowledge of this to other genocides, particularly Rwanda, but he was totally unable to see the suffering of Palestinian people. And that was because they were suffering at the hands of Israeli Jews. And that was a limit he couldn't cross, and I think that's a problem. So as you can imagine, I see my responsibility as documenting what's on the ground, really getting to know the realities, and then bringing the stories home. So my first book is basically my journey and the Israelis and Palestinians who taught me what I know. And then my film is basically an oral history of the conflict as told through the voices of Palestinians in the United States. So it's the history that you don't hear about. And then On the Brink is an examination of the run-up to the Gaza war. And again, it's a reality that you didn't see in mainstream media. I have another book coming out in February, which is again stories and analysis. And now I'm working on 2 children's books about Palestine. I actually have a potential publisher for one of them. So I'm trying all the different ways to get this conversation into our culture. I'm always respectful of the diversity of opinion, but I focus on the voices that are not usually heard, which are lefty Israelis and Palestinians. Now, many focus on 1967 as the start of what is euphemistically called the Troubles. And this is when East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza were occupied by Israel. And these are internationally recognized as occupied territories, but you also hear them described as disputed territories, liberated territories. In Israel, the West Bank is often referred to as Judea and Samaria, which implies a biblical claim to the region. So in this conversation, language is critical. And one of the first things that the Israelis did after 1967 was to declare that the territories were under its control, were administered or held rather than occupied. So that if they're not occupied, then you can occupy them. And so what's happened is that the Israeli government and its citizens have taken control of much of the West Bank. So we see the steady encroachment of Jewish settlements, the Israeli takeover of the Jordan Valley as a closed military zone, and the division of the West Bank into tiny cantons that get smaller and smaller, divided by bypass roads and checkpoints. And then we see a growing number of Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem. And the Israeli government claims that since 2005, when the Jewish settlers were removed from Gaza, that Gaza is no longer occupied. But you have to ask, what is a small strip of land that's totally controlled, the air, the sea, the economy, by another country that is frequently assaulted, et cetera, et cetera. So by many definitions, from the UN to international law, this remains occupied territory. And so what I see is a tremendous disconnect between language and reality. And if you look at the Jewish cities in the occupied territories, there's Ma'ale Adumim and Ariel. Are they Jewish neighborhoods? Are they greater Jerusalem? Are they settlements? Are they colonies? Again, language is critical. And I would argue that the current occupation is actually a continuation of more than 68 years of the colonization of Palestine, of treating Jews as more deserving, more human, and than Palestinians, and of Palestinians periodically, like many indigenous people, fighting back. And it's interesting, Moshe Dayan, who's a famous Israeli general, said that if he had been an Arab, he would have fought back too. And he also said that there's not a single place in this country that did not have an Arab population. So we also know that Palestinians have had a dysfunctional, ineffective, often corrupt leadership. This has only contributed to the catastrophe. But this has never been a battle between equal parties. So nothing is actually new, it just gets worse and more complicated. And the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé said that he sees 2 constant themes over the decades: dehumanization and elimination of an indigenous people. And if we look at the history, before 1948, Menachem Begin was a terrorist involved with the Irgun and the Stern Gang, and he fought with Ben Gurion, who was another terrorist with the Palmach and the Haganah. They battled each other, they killed civilians, they battled the British, and they were 2 militaristic groups. And most people don't know that before the British left, they succeeded in depopulating 220 Arab villages through intimidation, terror, and massacres. There were actually 33 massacres before a single Arab army attacked. So if you look at that history, getting rid of the indigenous Arab population, either actively or passively, was a fundamental part of building a Jewish state and of Zionism. And then these folks, Ben-Gurion, Begin, Shamir, all these guys, famous guys, all became prime ministers and the fathers of the state of Israel. So when you think about this, you have to ask, does the word terrorist actually have any meaning? And how we use it really depends on who we are and what point we're trying to make. So at this point, I see two big challenges for the American and Israeli Jewish communities. One is the recognition of the Nakba, the expulsion and dispossession of some 750 to 850,000 Palestinians in 1948, the destruction of over 500 villages. And as a minister once said to me, our collective denial about this fact creates a moral wound in all of us. And in the United States, this history is not part of the dominant paradigm. You know, the Jews are the good, peace-seeking people, and the Arabs are the bad, violent people. And in Israel, Nakba history is not taught in the schools. Commemoration of the Nakba is actually a civil offense. So imagine learning US history without slavery, without Native Americans, without Japanese internment. How would you know how this country happened and why it is the way it is? And we see now aggressive right-wing attacks from thugs on the street to members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, if an Israeli, either Jew or Palestinian, seeks to bring this history to light. So the question for me is, why is this so difficult? And I think it's a blend of ethics, morality, psychology, shame, trauma, entitlement. You know, the Jewish self-image is that we're the good people. We're the victims of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust. We deserve a country. Our victimhood gives us permission to do whatever is necessary to feel safe. So in this framing, security is the holy word. And besides, Jews don't commit genocide, don't commit massacres, rape. That's how the non-Jews behave. That's how I was brought up. So it's very painful to acknowledge, particularly after the Holocaust, that one of the consequences of founding the State of Israel was the violent destruction of an indigenous people who had lived there for centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and who were actually not interested in being colonized or losing land. So this conflict is not really about Arabs fighting Jews. It is about Arabs challenging Zionism, which is a political national movement that privileges Jews over everyone else. So this not only challenges our cultural self-image, but acknowledging the Nakba means that we have to apologize. We have to do recompense and reparations. This is painful, difficult stuff. I think the second big challenge is around the issue of Zionism. Now, there are many kinds of Zionism, but I would ask, what are the consequences of the political Zionism as it is now practiced? So we have a country that was founded on the basis of establishing an Arab-free state where Jewish trauma, aspirations, and history are privileged at the expense of everyone else. And you know, the common argument I hear is, well, given the injustices in the world, we have to do this to save ourselves. So how does that look? And is it really a defensible and sustainable argument? Now, few people are aware that after 1948, Palestinians who remained in the State of Israel, so they had Israeli citizenship in the early 50s, lived under military rule and with a system of checkpoints and permits until 1966. So they're citizens of Israel and they're living under military rule. And they were unable to get compensation for their lost property and homes. There are currently 57 laws that explicitly privilege Jews over non-Jewish citizens in Israel. Jews enjoy something called national rights, the Trump citizenship rights. So ethnicity is above citizenship in Israel. 93% of the land is functionally reserved for Jews only. And there are differences between opportunities for Jewish and Palestinian Israeli citizens in work, schools, access to universities, recognition of villages, even the provision of services like electricity and water or obtaining a permit to have a building. And at this point, 43% of Israeli towns have something called a residential committee that assesses incompatibility with social and cultural fabric. That's a code word for Arab. So despite the gorgeous ads in the New York Times and the belief that Israel functions as a modern Western democracy with all the warts, trying to survive in this dangerous neighborhood, Israel's actually a very segregated place. There are Jewish towns and schools and Arab towns and schools. There are grave discrepancies in funding, supports, and at this point, 99% of Israeli kids graduate from high school having gone through a totally segregated school system. Now, not surprisingly, there's a growing racism in Israel towards Arabs. So in the occupied territories, there are Jewish-only buses, there are Arab-free streets. A majority of Jewish Israelis would not allow an Arab in their home, would not be willing to sit next to an Arab or be willing to go to school or live next to an Arab. And that's pretty ironic because many Jewish Israelis are from Arab countries. They have grandmothers that speak Arabic. And so when they became Israelis, they got de-Arabized and they lose that previous identity. There was a study that showed that 56% of Israeli Jews support separate buses in the West Bank. Almost half don't want any Arab employment near Jewish kindergartens. A quarter don't want any Arab employment in hospitals, which is a place where there is a lot more integration. And there was a recent poll that revealed that a third of Israelis think that Arab citizens of Israel should not have the right to vote. And a poll that came out in March revealed that nearly half of Israeli Jews want to expel the Arabs from Israel. So this is becoming an increasingly worrisome situation. And I found this thing, and I was looking at issues that have come up, and there was an article on Israeli hotels that routinely warn Jewish guests if there are going to be a lot of Arab guests, so if it's Eid or some Arab holiday, and they offer them another booking time. And imagine if you were coming to a hotel and they warned you that there were going to be a lot of Jews there, a lot of blacks. I mean, in our context, it would seem completely outrageous. Now, the political leadership has also been moving to the right, which is also very worrisome. And we see that human rights groups and anti-occupation groups like Breaking the Silence, which is a group of soldiers that are talking about the occupation, are under attack from the right wing to labor to government ministries. It's gotten really, really hard for these folks. And Benjamin Netanyahu, in May, named a very right-wing nationalistic fascist, Avigdor Lieberman, as his defense minister. And this guy lives in a settlement. He's from the Soviet Union. He wanted to attack Iran, bomb Egypt. He's very aggressive about Palestinians. He wanted loyalty oaths. He's not a good actor. And just in July, B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization with the UN, noted that more Palestinian homes have been demolished in 2016 than any other year. So far this year there have been 740 Palestinians with Israeli citizenship made homeless, Palestinians made homeless, and this includes 348 children. And I want you to think about what is the impact of children when their homes have been demolished. You may also have read about Netanyahu's war against his generals. Now, the generals are the guys who actually enforce the occupation. So they are worried about Netanyahu. So we should be really worried. So recently, top security chiefs and military leaders were highly critical of Netanyahu. Well, one former defense minister said Israel is moving towards an apartheid state. The former head of Mossad said that Iran is not an existential threat, it's the conflict with the Palestinians. The former head of Mossad described Netanyahu as a danger to Israel. And a guy who was the former head of the Shin Bet was interviewed for a film called The Gatekeepers. Have people seen that film? Yeah. So the interviewer says to him, he reads him a quote from a famous Israeli intellectual who, back in 1968, that's just right after the occupation started, that if Israel kept the occupied territories, quote, it will be inflicted with the corruption typical to colonial regimes. The government will constantly have to deal with oppressing an Arab rebellion and with acquiring Arab kislings. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, will suffer from atrophy and become an occupation army. Then the interviewer looked Diskin in the eye and said, what do you think of this statement when you look at the state of Israel? Diskin looked straight into the camera and said, I agree with every word in it. We need to be worried. Now, Netanyahu has also been very busy appointing less independent, less charismatic, and less critical leaders. So his forces are more from the national religious sector, both in the government and in the military. And his coalition involves the ultra-Orthodox, the national religious, settlers, and immigrants. This is a very dangerous combo. So I think what we're seeing is a government out of control. Now, Jewish Israeli society is also very diverse and very complicated. It's mostly secular. A little less than half the population are Ashkenazi Jews. These are the white Eastern European Jews who tend to be in the elite. And the remainder are Jews of color from Northern Africa and Arabic-speaking countries. And the Jews of color have experienced discrimination and economic disadvantage since they arrived in the country. So even amongst the Jewish population, there's endemic racism towards Jews of color. Now these folks are called Mizrahi, and they tend to be at the bottom of the economic ladder and the political ladder. They tend to be a part of the major settlement blocks. And they are obviously very racist towards Arabs. And as the Tom Lehrer song goes, everybody hates the Sudanese and the Eritrean refugees who are detained in prison camps and deported back to dangerous places. So when you look at this picture, I think it's clear that Zionism and racism are related and very difficult topics. And it's important to pay attention to these details. Now I want to walk you through a case, what I consider a case study of this. Because one of the areas that I find particularly troubling was how the 2014 war on Gaza was framed in our Western press. So typically you heard, if Hamas would just stop firing those rockets, we could have peace. They're all terrorists. Israel must defend itself. I can't tell you how many times I heard that. Well, I happened to be in the region during the 3 weeks before the run-up to war. I just happened to be having a delegation. So I got to see on the ground what it looked like, and it was totally different than what people were seeing in the mainstream media. So I arrived on this Health and Human Rights delegation, and then shortly thereafter, 3 Hebron settler youth were kidnapped. And this unleashed just this horrific barrage of military might, home incursions, arrests, and killings. Netanyahu blamed Hamas, although he didn't have any evidence, which was very odd since the West Bank is crawling with Israeli soldiers and collaborators, so you'd think if there was evidence he would have found it. And this looked like a pogrom to me. 10 Palestinians were killed, 600 were arrested. There was vitriolic incitement coming out of Israel from the leadership on down, calling Palestinians snakes. I mean, really racist, horrific stuff. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship were being attacked in the streets. Lefty Jews were being attacked by thugs. I mean, it was really pretty nuts. And we were trying to figure out, why is this explosion happening? And it was very clear to us fairly quickly that Netanyahu wanted to stop the unity government between Hamas and Fatah, which was being talked about at the time. And this just totally blew it up. Now, 2 weeks after the initial incident, we found out that the IDF knew that the settler youth were dead 1 or 2 days after they were gone. But they kept that a secret because they needed an excuse to invade the West Bank. Then they announced that they found the bodies, and we'll never know when they found the bodies. And then there was the abduction and burning of a Palestinian teenager, which was clearly a revenge killing. The police put out a rumor that he was gay, and this was an honor killing, which was completely outrageous. Then a Palestinian-American kid was beaten up by the IDF, and when he got out of the hospital, he was put under house arrest, and when he went back to America, his Palestinian family was targeted and arrested. Not surprisingly, East Jerusalem exploded, the police used live fire, and this led to what people called the mini-intifada, a battle over the Temple Mount and Noble Sanctuary. So we saw right-wing Jews, armed and coming in with a tremendous amount of security, demanding to pray on the Temple Mount, even though rabbis were saying that that's forbidden under Jewish law. So this was not a religious thing. This was about nationalistic political incitement with fascistic overtones at one of Islam's holiest sites. It's like poking Palestinians in the eye. And then we saw sporadic Palestinian violence and increasing Jewish attacks on Palestinians. So after all that was going on, at the end of June, Hamas launched 30 rockets. It was the first time since 2012. You could say they were provoked by all the horrific things that were going on in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. You could say this was a form of resistance. You could say that this was a provocation and they deserved everything they got. But I think it's important to keep this framing. So the big question was, why did the Israelis go to war? And the initial framing was, we have to avenge the killing of the youth. And then it changed to, we have to stop all the rocket fire from Gaza, which was triggered by everything the Israelis were doing. And you always have to worry when the reason for going to war keeps changing. And then we heard, no, it's to destroy the tunnels between Gaza and Israel. And clearly there cannot be tunnels between Gaza and Israel, but tunnels can be destroyed from either end. The Egyptians destroyed the tunnels between Rafah and Egypt from the Egyptian side without invading Gaza. So then it finally became a collective punishment of all of Gaza, a destruction of the infrastructure, the leadership, and it was the 3rd time in 6 years and the worst time. And it is what Netanyahu called mowing the lawn, which is a particularly racist, horrific thing. So I then arrived a year later in March and actually got a permit to get into Gaza, which I'd be happy to talk about if you want to know, but I was there for 10 days. And what I saw a year later was that most of the Gazans I talked with and the tone there was they were disgusted and disenchanted with Hamas, Fatah, politicians in general. I mean, they were really feeling left at the edge of the world. And at the same time, they were very proud that Hamas stood up to the Israeli Defense Force. They were also aware of the huge price and utter devastation in Gaza, and it was just a horrific humanitarian catastrophe, which I got to personally witness. So here is a piece of land 6 by 26 miles in size. It's tiny. And they had 20,000 tons of explosives dropped on them in 51 days. A year later, when I was there were still 100,000 displaced people, a third of them living in their bombed-out houses. 3/4 of the population was food insecure, and on food assistance. Electricity was 8 to 12 hours a day. Tens of millions of liters of sewage were pouring into the Mediterranean due to the bombing of the treatment plants and electrical plants. They had a fraction of their water needs, and at that point they were saying there would be no drinkable water in Gaza in 2016. We're now in 2016. The maternal mortality rate had doubled. The neonatal mortality rate had almost doubled. And it's important to remember that the Israelis damaged or destroyed 17 out of 32 hospitals and 50 out of 97 primary health centers. The rebuilding was very slow because of issues around what they call dual usage, no concrete, because they don't want tunnels built, but that means no one can rebuild their houses. There was a tremendous lack of healthcare, education, access to work, and security. It was estimated that there were over 7,000 unexploded remnants of war waiting to be recovered. It's now 2 years later, and not much has changed. There are now 1.7 million people in Gaza. There are more cross-border attacks. They're locked in by Israel and Egypt. This is basically an explosion waiting to happen. Probably 1/4 of the houses have been rebuilt. 1/3 of Gaza's agricultural land is now under restricted buffer zones, so they can't farm there. And I work with a project called We Are Not Numbers, which is dealing with college students in Gaza who want to learn to write good essays in English. And so they have mentors in the US. So I read their essays and correct their English, but I see what they're writing about. And what they're writing about is just heartbreaking catastrophe. Now the UN looked at this in May, and they noted that the Israelis has suspended the importing of private cement, that the water and sewage catastrophe continues, that the health sector is still struggling with, they don't have medicines, they don't have fuel, it's just a disaster. The Gaza power plant was shut down because it didn't have any fuel, and then they didn't have water, and then they didn't have electricity. I mean, it's all cascades from one catastrophe to another. And then the fishermen who have been fighting to fish in the Mediterranean now still only can go out 1/3 of the way that was designated by the Oslo Accords. So issues around food security and hunger are rampant. And currently the UN estimates that Gaza will be uninhabitable by 2020, which isn't that far away. So a report came out in Israel in May that said that the Israeli leadership didn't seriously consider easing the economic restrictions that might have delayed the eruption of the war, and that they also had no strategy or goals regarding Gaza. And this is from an Israeli state controller. An Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, announced also in May that they're not going to work with the Israeli military justice system anymore because they said it's fruitless and just hopeless to work with them. So I think it's really important to ask the question, who is violent? There was a study in 2014 with US and Israeli professors that found that 79% of all conflict pauses between Israel and Gaza were interrupted when Israel killed a Palestinian, 79%. And only 8% were interrupted by Palestinian attacks. They also found that the longer the pause between conflicts between Gazans and Israel, the more likely that the Israelis would break the pause. So I think it's important to think about, in this setting, what is the impact of state terrorism? There's just an enormous amount of reality, injustice, and deprivation that we just don't see. And that may actually account for instance, the desperate, horrific knife attacks that we've been hearing about that really terrorize Israelis, but it's not coming out of nowhere. And I think it's important to look at the context in which this is happening. On top of this, Netanyahu really stokes the flames. I mean, he promises harsh responses. He blames Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas for everything. And he wants us to think that this is a big religious fight. And he would like the world to see what, hooligans and religious fanatics the Palestinians are. But this is not a religious struggle. It's a struggle for human and civil rights. And there was an amazing statement that came on the Holocaust Remembrance Day, I don't know if you folks saw it in May, by the Deputy IDF Chief of Staff. And he said he was frightened by the, quote, revolting trends in Israeli society, which were similar to those of Germany in the 1930s. That's a pretty radical statement. So my understanding of Israel is very different from when I started. I not only appreciate the tremendous accomplishments of the state, but I'm also deeply concerned with the corruptive realities, the ongoing occupation, the second-class citizenship of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and the long unresolved issue of Palestinian refugees. I have a much deeper understanding of Zionism as a political movement, of the realities for Palestinians of the war in 1948, and the consequences of establishing a state where Jews are privileged over everyone else, and where there has been a steady expansion of borders and increasing militarization of the Israeli society. I worry about the cost of all this to Jewish Israelis, who are increasingly right-wing and racist and militaristic, as well as the price for Jews everywhere in the diaspora and for Palestinians worldwide. And when I examine the Palestinian resistance, I have increasing respect for Palestinian civil society, who called in 2005 for a campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanction. This is a growing international movement and a powerful nonviolent strategy that I think we need to pay serious attention to. Now, in the American Jewish community, there are enormous conflicts, as you know, on this topic. If you want to have a good fight at your family dinner, you don't mention the word Israel. But that's because there are a tremendous amount of contradictions. You know, Jews are traditionally progressive. We had leadership roles in labor and civil rights and women's movement and gay rights and all those kinds of things. And many of us feel that we are being asked to suspend our love of justice, democracy, and fighting for the oppressed when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And we see a growing number of right-wing forces, groups like Campus Watch, Stand With Us, CAMERA, which is Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, which is an ironic title, AIPAC, which is the lobby, the David Project, Israel Action Committee. They're a long list, many of them aligned with the Christian right, many of them lobbying our Congress to support the most right-wing governments in Israel. And with all of this, we see a muzzling of dissent and tolerance in our own community. And I think it's important to step back and say, how did this muzzling happen? Well, if you go back to right after World War I, the colonial powers, as you know, divided the Middle East into nation states with little regard for the indigenous people and their histories. And Palestine, historic Palestine, was included in that pile of colonial powers. And then in 1948, there was massive support for the founding of the State of Israel that was really grounded in world guilt over the Holocaust and over the terrible immigration policies that led up to the Holocaust, where countries closed their doors to desperate Jews fleeing the Nazis. In the 1950s, with the Cold War, Israel was the bulwark against Egypt, which was allied with the Soviet Union. So the US was against Arab nationalism as a proxy for the Soviet Union, so that was the function of Israel for the US. But it was a bumpy ride. In 1956, Eisenhower forced the Israelis to leave the Sinai after a conquest that they had. And there were many cases where they were pushed, they were pulled, but it was basically a trend towards support. And Israel became the foot in the door to the oil-rich countries of the Middle East for the US. And Jews were the good people, Arabs were the bad people. The Jews were like us. They were white people creating a Western-style state in a savage, untamed region of the world. And with that framing, the racism, Islamophobia, the cultural and economic and military imperialism, we were really unconscious of all that. During Nixon's presidency, he referred to Israel as, quote, one of the cops on the beat. And what he was talking about was Israel controlling the Middle East for US interests, along with their buddies, the Shah of Iran and Turkey. And then after the '67 war, there was a gradual move towards making uncritical support of Israel the cornerstone of being a good Jew in the United States. And thus the ability to have any kind of critical discourse really narrowed. So being a Jew and being a Zionist and supporting Israel, right or wrong, all merged, to the point that one of the leaders in the Jewish community said to me, Israel is the religion. And with that, diaspora Jews can feel Jewish very easily. You just stand with Israel. You don't have to go to temple and do any of the other things. The other thing that happened after the '67 war is that Christian Zionists embraced the idea that all Jews should, quote, return to the Holy Land, and they started pouring political support and millions of dollars into the settler movement. So if you go into the big settlements, you see plaques to Hagee and all these Christian fundamentalists, and it's because they poured money into this. Liberal Christians bought the glorious mythology, which was glorious, and gave Israel a pass on the human rights issues. And then when the Shah collapsed in 1979, Israel's role became even more important. And it was also by then providing subsidiary services to the United States, helping the US evade the sanctions against South Africa, supporting terrorist states and terrorist groups in Central America. So Israel became a very valuable client state and surrogate for the United States. And the US began developing a major military-industrial complex with Israel. And then after 2001, Israel became our partner in the fight against terrorism. You know, Israel's a high-tech startup nation. It's the mirror image of the US. It's our partner fighting all these crazy Arabs. So with this framing, the history, the trauma, the rights, the aspirations of Palestinians became ever more invisible. But it's even more complicated than that. In 1974, the Anti-Defamation League, which started out as a progressive organization, defined something they called the new anti-Semitism, which was any criticism of Israel. And then in 1982, after Israel's disastrous invasion of Lebanon, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, all the civilian deaths, the Israeli government turned to the issue of controlling the message. And this was the birth of something called Israeli Hasbara, which is propaganda. So this means defining aggression as self-defense, a one-dimensional message: the enemies hate us, they're fanatics, they don't care about dying, they like to die, they send their children to kill, that kind of stuff. And the Jews are innocent victims again, so there was always the evoking of the Holocaust. AIPAC, 2 years later, issued a college guide exposing what they saw as rampant anti-Israel campaigning on campus and labeled that as anti-Semitic. So with all these cultural forces, a kind of McCarthyism crept into Jewish institutions. And the epithet of anti-Semitism was used fairly loosely to silence and demonize critical voices. Israel jumped into the fray in 2010 with a conference in Herzliya that was called Winning the Battle of the Narrative, Strategic Communication for Israel. So the problem isn't that there is an occupation, the problem is that they have to reaffirm the branding, rebranding Israel as a better place. And they laid out a strategy with US PR companies as well as Israeli government of naming and shaming people who are critical of Israel, going after Jewish institutions and finding the less critical and dividing them from the more critical. And they introduced the concept of creating a positive Israeli brand. It had to be marketed right. And they also introduced the word delegitimize. So they were going after people who, quote, delegitimize Israel. A Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs was created, and this group works with front groups in the United States to do this propaganda messaging. The Jewish Federation poured millions of dollars also into the fight against delegitimization through naming and shaming. An Israeli military unit was created to monitor Western groups, evolved in calling for boycott. And then in 2011, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that made the call for boycott within Israel a civil wrong. And there is also now a bill in the Knesset to deny internationals who support boycott entry into Israel. And it hasn't passed yet, but I have a friend who was deported from Ben Gurion Airport for his BDS activism. So this is the next thing to hit. In academia, you all know what Hillel is. It's a center of Jewish life on campus, where you can find a nice Jewish boyfriend and eat kosher food. They present as a very liberal-minded organization, but they actually have very strict guidelines about what you're not allowed to say about Israel. And then in 2014, there was something called the Amcha Initiative, that's your people in Hebrew. And it basically issued a blacklist of over 200 Middle East studies professors who were declared anti-Israel and dangerous to take courses from. Hillel International, along with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which used to be a good organization searching out Nazis, then developed a new campus surveillance tool, a phone app to fight anti-Semitism. They're encouraging students to monitor their professors and report their offenses. And if you look at the offenses, they're criticisms of Israel. They're not real anti-Semitism. And there are groups like that, plus Campus Watch, David Project, Stand With Us, Campus Maccabees. I mean, you run into them all over that are all doing this monitoring work. And last year, the Center for Constitutional Rights, along with a group called Palestine Legal, issued a document called The Palestine Exception to Free Speech, a movement under attack in the US. And they documented what's happening to people who criticize Israeli policy. And a particularly good example is a new organization I just came across called the Canary Mission. And this launched this year. And it's a website, it's anonymous, and they publish sort of bits and pieces of information about academics, students, activists, and their goal is to deny future employment to the students that are targeted. So they create these blacklists, and they have a quote on the website: "It is your duty to ensure that today's radicals are not tomorrow's employees." So this is very worrisome stuff, and this is all going on right now as we speak. Now, we often hear of the rampant anti-Semitism on US college campuses. Again, I would defer that it's not anti-Semitism all the time, but incidents obviously do occur. But there are also a tremendous amount of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-African-American, anti-gay. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on college campuses. But as far as Jewish students go, there's a tremendous amount of confusion between criticism of Israel, which makes students feel very uncomfortable, as opposed to anti-Semitism, which makes students feel unsafe. And I think they've lost their ability to distinguish between being uncomfortable and unsafe. But, you know, what is the data? Is that really going on? And in May, this study came out of University of California, where there's supposed to be a lot of anti-Semitic activity, and they found that 84% of Jewish students and faculty felt comfortable on campus. And they were actually more comfortable than the Christians and the Muslims. So, yeah, there's a lot of hype here, but not a lot of data. And it was actually a study that just came out of Tel Aviv University that noted that anti-Semitic incidents worldwide had declined in 2015 by 50%. Now, you would never know that reading our papers. And then if you look at our community, there are worrisome things. The Anti-Defamation League, again, which once was a progressive organization, has a whole program to train our police in Israel. And they join with the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and thousands of American police have now trained with the Israeli police and the Israeli army in a big law enforcement exchange program. So, and the New York City police now actually have a branch, an office in Tel Aviv. So we have our police, who are supposed to be protecting civilians, emulating the Israeli Defense Forces, which are an occupying army. We have academics who are monitored and attacked. We have university donors pressuring administrators to change what's going on campus. We have student groups sympathetic to Palestinians being attacked and thrown out. And we have critics being emotionally blacklisted and blackmailed with the epithet of anti-Semite. And then there are a host of very well-funded right-wing attack organizations, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Pamela Geller's American Freedom Defense, things like that, that really are very sort of Trumpian in their way of messaging. And even if we look at our presidential campaign, you know, Hillary has said that the first person to be invited to the White House is Netanyahu. And she's also very clearly gone after the boycott movement as anti-Semitic. And if we're on the topic of politics, you know, Trump had this big statement that President Obama has not been a friend to Israel. And there was this amazing essay in the New York Times, and they said, right, he's not been a friend to the tune of over $20.5 billion in foreign military financing since 2009. He's not been a friend by providing over $1.3 billion for the Iron Dome defense. He has not been a friend by opposing 18 resolutions in the UN that were biased against Israel, by helping to organize in 2015 the first UN General Assembly session on anti-Semitism, and by working tirelessly on a two-state peace, not least on the security arrangements for Israel that are among its preconditions. He has not been a friend by turning the other cheek in the face of what Nancy Pelosi once called the insult to the intelligence of the United States from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So the New York Times has got it. And you have to ask, if that doesn't make you a friend of Israel, what do you have to do to qualify? There's also increasing lawfare against the boycott movement. So this McCarthyism is really becoming part of the national political discourse. And there are ongoing efforts both on the national level and the state level to make calling for boycott an offense because of it being anti-Semitic. You will see this clearly stated. Fortunately, there's a lot of pushback. And a lot of it comes under the topic of intersectionality. So what that means is that there's growing momentum in the campuses and on communities between the people who are involved in Israel-Palestine activism and Palestinian human rights activists, labor, racial justice, immigrant rights, faith-based LGBTQ, all sorts of movements coming together to find our commonality. So a perfect example is what the police do. So the police brutality in Ferguson is very similar to the police brutality in the West Bank, and in fact, they trained our police and they're using our weapons and it's all the same thing. And just to bring it home, Sturm Ruger is headquartered in Connecticut, although they make their rifles in New Hampshire, and these are the sniper rifles that are used by the IDF. So if you want a little target, it's right in your backyard. With the internet, fortunately, and social media, and smartphones, and alternative trips, and all the other ways that we can get information, people are getting a much better understanding of the realities on the ground. So despite the hoopla, the public opinion in the United States is actually shifting away from Israel, particularly amongst young people, liberals and progressives, and people of color. A recent poll showed that 51% of Democrats support imposing economic sanctions or some form of action against Israel over settlements. You would never know this looking at the Democratic Convention. And there was just a poll from the Arab American Institute that showed that 65% of Americans think that Jewish Israelis and Palestinians should have equal rights. So Americans are beginning to wake up. And obviously, as soon as we wake up, the right wing takes note and pushes back the pushback. So Palestine Legal is now reporting a massive increase, 22% increase in the incidence of against activists in 2016. So it's all ratcheting up. And the problem is that the pushback is funded by people with billions of dollars, like Chaim Sabin, who's Hillary's main funder, and Sheldon Adelson, who's with Trump. So they all have their billionaire backers. And you've probably heard that in New York, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order that has barred the state from doing business with companies that support boycott. So this is really happening as we speak. I mean, it's all probably illegal and against the First Amendment, but this is all going to have to work its way through. We also see that in student bodies at more than 25 colleges and universities, there have been multiple resolutions calling for divestment from Israel or from companies that profit from the occupation. There have also been a lot of efforts in the Christian community with the Presbyterian Church, United Church of Christ, United Methodist. There's a lot of activity in the religious community. Human Rights Watch recently called for a report urging businesses to cease operations in the settlements. The European Union is demanding that products that are produced in the settlements are labeled, because they're not labeled as settlement products now, they're labeled as products of Israel. So there's all this economic stuff that's going on. And there's also pushback within the Jewish community. We're clearly not a monolithic group. Over half of Jews in America who are under 35 actually don't have any interest in Israel or feel sympathy for Palestinians. And there are many groups that are questioning the dogmatic framing and political stances of Jewish religious and communal organizations. And they're doing that in the name of Jewish values, Jewish religion and culture. And if you look at the boycott movement, Jews are very active in it. And you see a massive growth of organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace. There's If Not Now, Open Hillel. I can talk more about those if you want to know. There's a big growing movement out there. So what we see happening is that Jews and our allies are engaged in a louder and louder discursive battle, a struggle over the meaning and understanding of history and how to move forward. We are trying to separate Judaism, the religion, from Zionism, the national political movement. I constantly hear Zionism has hijacked Judaism. There is a call to define a Jew as someone grounded in religion or culture and history, a set of ethics, a set of peoplehood. All these definitions are equally valid. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the diaspora or in Israel, you're all Jewish. And diaspora Jews we are claiming our legitimacy as Jews and also claiming our right to be critical of a country that speaks in our name. There is also a delineation of the racist ideology of anti-Semitism, hating a person, a group, or an institution because it is Jewish, from thoughtful moral criticism of the policies of the country Israel. So the treatment of and solidarity with Palestinians has now become the civil rights issue of the day for modern Jews, especially younger Jews who will no longer be here, who will be here long after the older post-Holocaust generation moves on. So I see diaspora Jews are beginning to really grapple with the Nakba as part of our own history. And I think we're beginning to understand that Israeli exceptionalism needs to be challenged. That Israeli exceptionalism is actually an obstacle to honest conversation around human, civil, and political rights in the Middle East. And I really believe that after centuries of powerlessness, how we as a community handle our new position of power and privilege is critical to the survival of an ethical Jewish tradition, as well as a just resolution to a more than century-old struggle that is being fought in our name. Thank you.